what did Americans do after they learned about the Declaration of Independence? Well, in fact, they did a whole variety of things. Some people went about their normal days, though nothing had ever happened. Other people became really worried about whether the colonies would actually break from Great Britain, and other people celebrated. Other people were really excited. People had parades, they had bonfires, they rang bells, they shot these 13-gun salutes, 13 guns to represent the 13 colonies. People drank, and many people were very, very excited. But we have to remember that even though people were doing all of these things when they heard about the Declaration of Independence, it wasn't that the Declaration started the revolution. It was more that the Declaration reaffirmed, it supported, it justified things that they were already thinking. So if we think, for example, about a town or a city like Boston, and we think about, the Boston Massacre and then the dumping of the tea, there are all of these events that were in many ways leading up to the Declaration of Independence. So when people heard the Declaration of Independence, it supported ideas and thoughts that they had, and it formalized them. And it justified the feelings that a lot of people had. And so that was really important. It made a lot of people think that their belief that the colonies should break from Great Britain was correct. And because it made many people feel justified in their sensibilities, it allowed many Americans to move forward with the revolution. So after the Declaration was distributed, disseminated, what words, what phrases stood out to people? I want to answer that question, but in doing so, I want to give a little bit of context. One question that we have to answer is, how did people hear about or learn about the Declaration? They learned about the Declaration in a variety of different ways. The Declaration was announced in newspapers. It was sent out in broadsides, these large pieces of paper that allowed the Declaration to be printed entirely on one side. It was sent out in letters. People in cities were able to read it or hear it. People even in the countryside who might not have been close to those distribution centers where you might read a newspaper, even those people got to hear it. And this was crucial because the Declaration was printed and distributed in so many different ways. Because it was read and because it was heard, this meant that people at different levels of society got to learn about the Declaration. Men learned about the Declaration. Women learned about the Declaration. Children learned about the Declaration. Native people learned about the Declaration. The enslaved people learned about the Declaration. And so this is a key point, because you might think, well, many enslaved people didn't know how to read and write. Many women or children didn't know how to read and write. That's true, but it's also true that because the Declaration was disseminated, distributed in so many different ways, it didn't necessarily matter whether or not you could read it. You heard it. Another important point to consider is the fact that the Declaration was not necessarily a short document. It starts with 2 paragraphs, and then we have these 27 grievances or critiques of the King of England, and then it ends with 3 paragraphs. So if you're reading it, even if you were a supporter of this document, there were different things that you might emphasize, that you might choose, that you might pick out. And so for many colonists, they emphasized language coming from those last 3 paragraphs. This was language that justified the break from Great Britain. This was language that argued that each of these colonies were justified in becoming free and independent states. And when we think about the revolution, right, this in many ways was the start of the United States. So it obviously makes sense that many people would focus on this language about separation, and that would focus on this language that justifies the creation of these new states. At the same time, Many people, because they brought their personal experiences to bear in how they interpreted this document, this led them to interpret other parts of the document. So you can have white people and black people who both agreed on the significance of the document and who were energized by the document, but yet who emphasized different parts of the document. And so many people of African descent, many enslaved people, and even free black people, they emphasized language that came from the first two paragraphs of this document. They emphasized this language about human equality, and they emphasized this language about rights, unalienable rights. The word unalienable means that these are things that can't be taken away from you. Now, why would you have African Americans focus on the language of equality and rights and maybe de-emphasize or not emphasize as much the language on separation and free and independent states? Well, the obvious answer, or maybe it's not so obvious, but the answer is slavery. They were taking these principles that we now take for granted today, and they were highlighting those principles. And this raises another kind of interesting question, because African Americans, people who were enslaved, they were highlighting a contradiction in the way the Declaration was presented. How could it be the case that many colonists were arguing that they should separate from Great Britain, that they were arguing that they were metaphorically enslaved by Great Britain, while they themselves owned and enslaved people? Well, African Americans wanted to point this out to many colonists. And it's important to remember that we live in a society today where we argue that slavery should be illegal. And I think that's a great thing. And I think the Declaration helped change society, helped transform society. So people who took slavery for granted, who didn't necessarily experience slavery themselves, they began to rethink their own social practices. And they listened to the voices of African Americans who were emphasizing this language of equality and rights. And many American colonists decided, yes, I'm doing something that maybe isn't correct, and I think I'm going to change it. There were other colonists who didn't make that decision, that's true, but we should remember that there were colonists who did. So African Americans, as I explained, had these distinctive readings of the Declaration of Independence that reflected their social experiences. So how did they have their particular readings of the Declaration heard and distributed? And how did they allow for those ideas to continue to be relevant? Well, immediately after the Declaration was published and then distributed, you had African Americans in Boston and in Connecticut who petitioned to their state legislatures. They made reference to the language of the Declaration, and again, they emphasized human equality and rights, natural rights or human rights. And by writing directly to the leaders of these colonies, they ensured that the leaders would at least be thinking about these things as they discussed these big issues about how to organize for war and what all kind of the consequences of that would be. It's also important to remember that even though you had African Americans who were able to give a kind of broader voice to a larger community via print, it's important to remember the vast numbers of African Americans who, through their actions, also made themselves heard. So if we think about the vast numbers of African Americans in the southern colonies who were faced with the choice, would they join British forces or would they join American Patriot forces? Their decisions influenced, in turn, the decisions of all of these leaders and even of everyday people. In addition to sending out petitions, African Americans wrote essays and they wrote pamphlets. So to come back to print culture, Prince Hall was a leader of Boston. He took the helm of a petition campaign that began actually before the Declaration of Independence was written and continued shortly thereafter. There's another gentleman by the name of Lemuel Hayes. He was a Connecticut preacher born of interracial parentage. And after the Declaration is written and disseminated, he actually writes an essay where he quotes directly from the American Revolution. And again, he wants to highlight these issues of human equality and of political rights. And then, even after the Revolutionary War ends, we have Benjamin Banneker, a man born of free African-American parents in Maryland. And he has this propensity, this genius for understanding the environment and understanding numbers. And so he writes an almanac, basically a book to help us kind of predict the weather and other environmental shifts. And and because he writes these almanacs and he stands out for his genius, he becomes kind of widely known. And one of the things that Benjamin Banneker does is in 1791, he writes to Thomas Jefferson, who at this time is the Secretary of State. We have to remember that Thomas Jefferson was one of the primary writers of the Declaration of Independence. Benjamin Banneker probably knows that. And so when he's writing to Thomas Jefferson, he knows that he's writing to somebody who's influential at the highest levels of American government. And what does Benjamin Banneker do in 1791 in this letter? Well, he emphasizes to Jefferson the importance of, and I'm sounding like a broken record here, but Benjamin Banneker emphasizes human equality and natural rights. We have to remember that as a consequence of the revolution, the northern states begin to free their enslaved populations, but the southern states had a moment when they considered freeing their enslaved populations, but then they decide not to. And so when Benjamin Banneker is writing in 1791, he's trying to keep the memory and the significance of the Declaration alive by writing to one of the current leaders and one of the writers of the Declaration, again, to emphasize the importance of thinking about the ending of slavery, to think about the importance of abolition. So I've spent time talking about what Americans did when they heard the Declaration. I've spent time talking about what parts of the Declaration Americans, and in particular African Americans, emphasized. And I've spent time talking about how African Americans wanted to keep their reading of the Declaration alive. And so, when we're thinking about celebrating the Declaration, African Americans, I think, celebrated the Declaration by trying to emphasize these principles that were articulated in the Declaration. That was really their way of trying to celebrate this document, give it a significance that would last beyond its writing. And so when we think about all of that, I have a question for you. How would you celebrate this Declaration of Independence in your town or community?